My name is John Cicero. I'm the Vice President for Mission Integration and Ministry here at Fordham University. I'm a Jesuit priest. I thought I had to say that since you might not know. David Marcotte asked me to say a few words of welcome, and I'm very happy to do so. But it's far too hot to wear clerical collar and jacket tonight, so I see that I'm in really compatible company here, which is great. I'm also a clinical psychologist, so your conference is of tremendous interest. I'm delighted on two counts. First of all, this is a great way to gather people who are coming from different Jesuit universities across the country. And this is a wonderful way for us to come together and think about important things together. And secondly, the content. I would love to be able to stay and listen to the conference. I got back last night from Germany, so I'm a bit jet lagged. So I'm going to head back to the Bronx. But I am interested, my own area in psychology is positive psychology, so I study a lot about virtue and how the acquisition of virtue leads to flourishing. But folks in positive psychology, I don't know if there are any others in the room here with me, but I think we would benefit tremendously from the kind of conversation that you are engaged in, which gives kind of a cultural and a historical and an ideological heft to the study of virtue by looking precisely at the humanities. So welcome to Fordham. It's a delight to have you here, and I know you're in good hands this evening with Matt and David and Leo and others whom I know here in the room. So all the best. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much for that welcome. My name is Matthew Clementi. I'm a fellow in the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics in the Lynch School of Education and Development at Boston College. And it's just an incredible honor and pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I should mention at the start that this event was made possible by the John Templeton Foundation, and we're incredibly grateful for their support. The three respondents that we have tonight, Laura Specker, Leo Guardado, and David Marcotte, are faculty ambassadors on a project that we have from the Templeton Foundation. They represent Fordham University. They represent the philosophy, theology, and psychology departments respectively. And this project is one that's trying to bring together the disciplines of psychology, philosophy, and theology to be more conversant in one another's languages and see what our shared learning can, how it can benefit our disciplines, and we can work toward a greater understanding of one another's competencies in our various fields. I want to welcome tonight the people who are joining us remotely. I'm told that we have nearly 100 people on the Zoom link right now. And for those of you who are joining us remotely, if you need CEs, you need to fill out the evaluation that will be sent to you within a week's time. And anyone here who's hoping to get CE credits for tonight, please see Emily, who's in the back, and she's just done an outstanding job helping us out tonight. So thank you, Emily, for that. Tonight's speaker, Graham Burnett, before I get into his biography, I'd like to just tell a little bit about how I got acquainted with Graham's work. It's kind of a funny story. I came upon him almost by accident. I stumbled upon a book that he had co-edited, and it struck me as fascinating, interesting. It just kind of drew me into the work that he was doing as a scholar who focuses on attention, but also how the discipline of history, which he teaches in, intersects with the arts and the humanities. And so I reached out to Graham almost on a whim. I just wrote him an email and I said, hey, I'm really interested in the work you're doing. I'd love to catch up. Is there something we could talk about? And he wrote me back, and we spent over an hour on Zoom. And it was just one of those experiences where you meet someone who's generous, warm, collaborative, who wants to invite people in. And one of those rare experiences where you're talking to someone who you just feel like this is a brilliant person I'm talking to, and someone who wants to share and enliven the work that we all do together. It was such a rich conversation that Graham and I have been communicating back and forth for a while, and I've been hoping and kind of begging and pleading him to do some stuff with us at the center, and he's been generous enough to come tonight and to speak to us. So I'm just absolutely enthused and very, very excited about the talk that he's giving. I'll say a little bit about Graham, and then I'll talk about the structure of the night, and then I'll get out of the way and let the speakers do their thing. So Graham Vernon is a historian of science. He was a 2013-2014 Guggenheim Fellow at Bard Graduate Center in New York City. He received a 2009 Mellon New Directions Fellowship, focusing on connections between sciences and visual arts. Graduating as salutatorian from Princeton in 1993, and a recipient of the recipient of the Pine Prize, Graham went on to earn his PhD at Cambridge University as a Marshall Scholar. Before joining Princeton in 2001, he taught at Yale, was a Mellon Fellow at Columbia University, and a Fellow at the New York Public Library. His interests, listed here, they're more various than I could even name, but they span things such as natural history, earth and sea sciences, cartography, navigation, oceanography, ecology, art, history, philosophy, theology, on and on and on. He's just an exceptional scholar and human being, and we're so glad to have him tonight. Very briefly, the way the evening will go, Graham will speak and give his remarks. Each respondent will have just a few minutes to offer kind of casual, off-the-cuff remarks. We like to keep this very collegial and conversational. And then after that, we'll open it up for discussion. So thank you very much, Graham. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much. That really warm introduction. I appreciate it, Matt. And thanks to all of you for coming out. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you about this stuff. I think I'll dive right in. My plan is to talk for, I don't know, somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes or so, 45 conceivably, depending on how you look out there, about some work that I've been doing with others. As Matt said, I'm really interested in kind of collaborative work. All of that work in different ways circles questions of human attention. And I thought there's so many different perspectives or angles we can bring to the subject of attention. I know that those of you who did the reading for this convening, that you have got a taste of some Baldenfels, if I'm not mistaken. You did some sort of phenomenology of the alien, which centers on the question of awakening oneself to alterity through attentional practices and the arts of attention. And you also read some Simone Weil, very close to my heart and the heart of a lot of us who work on these attentional questions in pragmatic and active ways. So you've already been dipping into the domain, sort of attention studies. And I thought what I would do is sort of drill down a bit on my disciplinary domain of expertise, because I'm a scholar, you are scholars, we each come from different fields. And as Matt generously laid out, my training was in the history and philosophy of science. So that means my kind of day job, I teach at Princeton. I teach undergraduate and graduate courses on the history of science, technology, to some extent medicine. I focus a lot on the human sciences these days. So in that sense, there's a recursive moment. Many of you are trained in psychology, but psychology itself, of course, has a history, and that history would fall within the domain of the history of science. And the book that I've been working on for a couple of years now, and from which I'll speak for the bulk of this presentation, is a book that looks at the laboratory study of human attention from about 1880 to about 1980. My aim is to understand how attention came to be codified within the experimental sciences in that sort of 20th century heartland period. my interest there is really, and here's where the hermeneutics comes in. I have a properly historicist interest, understanding what attention was in 1910, 1930, 1960, and why. Cutting across 1960 to understand, as I'll discuss in a moment, the relationship between conceptualizations of human attentional capacities and, say, very specific historical contexts of the Cold War. Cold War subjectivity, we need attentional subjects of a certain vigilance sort. Attention comes to be keyed to notions of vigilance in the context of Cold War psychology and even psychophysics in a way. Historicist, understanding things in their time and place. But all historians are also interested, I think, deeply and meaningfully in the present. We get the questions we want to ask of the past from the present. And to do a history of the scientific study of attention now is to do the history of a charged topic that's charged in a very particular way. And charged in a particular way because of the rise in the last, let's say, 15 or 20 years of a radically new, and I would argue, deeply troubling commercial program to commodify human attention as part of a new attention economy that has not human flourishing as its primary telos, are those who are driving the financialization and commodification of human attention within these cognitive prosthetics focused on the flourishing of the human person? No, they're focused on ROI, on the maximization of value in dollar terms. That language of value can move around, but you can always read it in the old school dollar sign sort of way, and that's how they read it. In that context, I understand the work that I've been doing as an academic, as a historian of science, and I teach on this stuff at Princeton. I'll talk about that in a second. Interested in the slicing and dicing of human attention within laboratory settings en route to the pricing of attention in our contemporary marketplace. So I would say, elevator pitch for the book. You want to understand how you get to marketplace of attention. You must first understand how something can be quantified and reified such that it can be traded in continuous market arbitrage. And this book, though it has a lot of relatively tedious nuts and bolts history of laboratory science stuff, some of which I will do to you this evening for your betterment. In big picture, why would we do that? I hope I've set that up for you a little bit. Make sense? There's a coda to this talk, and I've got the slides in here, and I'll again check in on your spiritual welfare before I do it to you, which is more like a sort of technical turn into contemporary philosophy of attention. Some of you may have a question that floats across this talk, which is like, well, what is attention anyway? You might be interested in that sort of essentializing question. You'd like to get your terms straight. We historians, follow Nietzsche, no definitions, only genealogies. So we slip that question. You want to know what attention is? My question back to you is when? Because attention is no thing but in time, which is how I prove that I'm a card-carrying historian. I tell my grad students, basically, over the next 5 years, you'll learn to be someone who can just draw and exactly like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you can bang, 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 and make the matchbox jump, hitting it every time by historicizing. You'll just anybody brings you an idea, you're I can historicize that, pow, 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 and make it skip across the room as you do it year by year, historicizing. That's what it is to be a historian. So basically, I'm going to historicize it. But I also did I'm a kind of philosophically interested human. And it's worth saying that historians of science often have a kind of epistemic bee in their bonnet, where people who are kind of philosophically obsessed, you might say, because the question of what makes science a discernible domain of a special kind of power knowledge feels like it requires that you speak to the questions of epistemology. You be able to explain how certain claim making achieves hegemony at any given time and in any given place. So most historians of science have a sort of philosophical preoccupation. And I have some slides in here on what I think of as a very interesting contemporary philosophical question around what attention is, that does actually land in a somewhat technical way in hermeneutics. So for those of you who have a soft spot for, you read the Waldenfels, so that's firmly in the continental hermeneutic tradition. The version of hermeneutics I would touch if we get there is really Gadamerian, and sort of like tee up Gadamer against some contemporary Oxford philosophers of mind. But let's see if it feels good by that point, or if we're kind of like, let's get our respondents up here. So with that, maybe I'll do a quick check-in for the folks who are out there in internet land. So from the back of the room, you who see what they see, are they seeing the right things? Like camera here, if I look at them like this, is it like I'm looking deep into their eyes? Right? I'm not just speaking to them, I'm speaking to you also. So, so we're here. And they're seeing what we're seeing too. Okay, thank you. So, contextualization a little bit. For the last, let's call it 10 years, I've been working on this attention stuff. Big chunk of that work has been, as I said, collaborative. And at the edges of academic work and engaging in academic work, but also beyond academic work. So I'm going to open by talking a little bit about that. At the end of last year, two colleagues of mine and myself published this op-ed in the New York Times, which actually, it's been very exciting to see the impact of the op-ed. The op-ed really was the first place that we used this language of fracking in connection with the contemporary operations of the attention economy. And that fracking language goes to the heart of what we take to be most worrisome about the way attention is currently being commodified. And I'll do that metaphor for you for 1 second, right? In fracking, does everybody have a sense of how fracking works? Like, you've heard that it's a bad thing, but then like the historian of technology in me likes to like get down into the like weeds with it. And don't you worry, you publish an op-ed that accuses, Alphabet of human fracking, you get a lot of emails from petroleum engineers who want to be like, and there's this aspect of fracking, and this aspect of fracking, and what about, and does your metaphor extend to the like part where we push the sand down to hold the channels open? And I'm kind of like, yes, we can build that up. Big picture, right? Petroleum wells, like, old style. Drill a hole into the ground, there's like a nice big oil zip down there, and the oil is under pressure and it kind of like gushers up to the top and you dance around under the like black rain and you're rich. That's the way it used to happen. There are like no oil zits left. No, we're done with those. You can't get oil out of the ground by doing that. You can't find those pimples finished. Fracking is a process by which oil and natural gas can be gotten up out of the earth when that oil and gas, they're widely distributed, not under kind of concentrated volumetrics, and they're harder to access because they're sort of in the sponge rock, often this deep shale. So to get those resources up to the surface, you actually have to pump down high pressure, high volume detergent, which forces open the tight channels of that Napoleon of thick rock down there, cracks it and fracks it open, and in a sense drives the good stuff back up to the surface under the pressure of the pumping down that you're doing, okay? And that's what makes it a perfect metaphor for what's happening to us now with these devices, right? we understand social media companies and companies that have as their primary business model the commodification of attention. They are pumping into our faces high pressure, high volume detergent in order to force up to the surface a spume of monetizable good stuff, meaning our eyeballs. And the metaphor is perfect because actually your attention, while extremely valuable for your life is actually not extremely valuable to Nike. Because the odds that you're going to buy a pair of Nike high tops in the next 11 minutes, minuscule, right? So what you're going to do with those 11 minutes is going to give shape to your existence. But Nike needs hundreds of thousands of people's eyeballs in order to have an odds-on opportunity to sell some high tops to somebody who's looking. So if you think about the logic of the marketplace, it's precisely like that kind of low volume, widely distributed, you gotta aggregate, you gotta concentrate, you gotta do some work to aggregate it and concentrate it to make it a valuable commodity. So, and the cost of getting it out of us is we understand that kind of like process by which stuff is pushed into us to like pull us to our own surfaces and out of ourselves. So that op-ed, which did get a fair bit of attention, helped those of us who are working in a kind of an activist way on these questions, and I can talk about that a bit more in a second. This is a recent academic edited book I did with a dear colleague. It's not the truly weird book to which Matt alluded earlier, by which he discovered my stuff, and that can come up at dinner if people are feeling brave. But this is a more straight shooting academic volume on interdisciplinary study of attention. This is the undergrad class I teach at Princeton. I've done a couple of cycles of this now. We do a kind of genealogy of attention since about 1610, and we bring it up to the present. This is the nonprofit coalition of writers, activists, academics, and artists who came together in 2018 at the Sao Paulo Biennial to begin thinking in terms of a kind of collective movement to resist this new form of human exploitation that we see as tied to this new technological capacity. So again, back of the envelope, Friends of Attention, coalition, nonprofit, activist-oriented, focused on what we call attention activism. Attention activism is pushing back against the monetization of this precious human capacity, pushing back by means of education, study, organizing, coalition building, and what we call making sanctuary, making protected spaces. And the main kind of thing that group has done up to this point would be twofold. We did a book together in 2022. It was published by Princeton University Press called The 12 Theses on Attention, which is a little bit like a manifesto around the kind of attention we need to protect ourselves from commodification. And then last year, we created a school in Brooklyn. And this is a going concern for those of you who are local. Love to give a shout out to the school. My friend Eve Mitchell, who's here, who trained in psychology, is also a facilitator at the Strother School, helps run the programming we do. We have classes, workshops, free workshops, work in schools, and then we do a variety of different kinds of classes. And this has been a really exciting project. And this was written up in the New Yorker piece that, to which Matt alluded recently. Okay, all of that's by way of background. And I hope it sets up for you that I'm interested in this stuff in an academic way, but I'm also really focused on what we do now in kind of an active way. And it would be worth maybe touching for the people in this room that I actually believe that the language of attention right now provides a very powerful language in which to breathe life into the embattled university ecology of the humanities. which may give some interest to some of you. I mean, you're primarily mostly social scientists, but to the extent Matt invoked the question of the relationship between the social sciences, the human sciences, and the humanities, and because I think the Cura Psychologia project specifically is interested in thickening, if you like, the sort of scientisms of contemporary psychology with a richer feel for humanistic tradition, I would argue that, you know, that which is beleaguered right now in English departments or in the other kind of historically core humanistic projects wants rearticulation in terms of the language of attention. And so there's more to say there. But let me do you a précis of the book I'm working on so we can get into some substance for a moment. So I'm going to just walk you through an outline of the book and do a few minutes on each of the chapters to give you a sense of how I would periodize the history of attention in the last 100 years, basically. So the first meaty chapter of the book is on a fascinating and totally forgotten episode in the early 20th century in which the earliest generation of experimental psychologists, almost all trained in Germany, they were at Leipzig, most of them worked with Wilhelm Wundt, and they, were following in the same tradition that William James, briefly tasted, and then was like, actually, I hate being in the lab all day. I think I'm gonna go do ether with my friends and write about religion instead. Hey, if you're recording this, that's not all there is to say about William James, okay? So that was just a joke. So they were in the labs and they were doing experimental work and they got interested in attention. And they did work on attention. And they had the biggest and most exciting finding, really, of a 25-year period, which, as I say, subsequent research has left this on the cutting room floor. But this group of experimentalists came to believe that human attention had a natural periodicity, just like breath, or like the rhythms of the heartbeat. Actually, it's a little tricky to explain how it worked, but they were doing experiments asking people to operate at the threshold of sensory capacities. And they recognized that there were certain oscillations in perceptibility at those thresholds. And whereas we've come to understand a fair bit of what they were then seeing in those oscillations as related to neurological stimulation and recovery times in neurological reactions. So that it was really, what they were seeing was at the level of sort of the nervous system, as opposed to at the level of consciousness. Those distinctions had not been tightly made because a robust kind of neuronal theory of human psychology was still evolving. And as a result, they identified these fascinating fluctuations in perception at the threshold of perceptibility as betraying the essential rhythmical periodicities of human attention. And they ran with this stuff. This is actually from the work of one of those figures in that period, from about 1909. And what you're seeing here is actually superimposed two rhythmical structures, one operating at about the scale of sort of 5 or 6 seconds, which are the larger waves, and then the subcomponent waves were like micro oscillations of the attentional capacity within that macro oscillation. And there was even a fabulous and ultimately speculative but beautiful theory for a period of time that something as fundamental as the universality of the phrasing structure that we would call sentences in human language. It's like one of those weird questions, like why do human languages break into sentences? Why is there like a kind of period to the movement of thought that gets articulated linguistically? And this turns out to be ubiquitous. Like machines have no taste for it, really, right? They don't need it. But humans do, whether they're speaking Tlingit or they're speaking German. It was thought actually that that was a function of the human attention wave, that sentence length was a reflection of the natural periodicity of human attentionality. So it's a super interesting passage, and there are actually some quite high stakes in that it ends up being a kind of breaking point between the psychology that focused on introspection as against the rise of behaviorism. So those will be terms for those of you who are in psychology. You'll be aware that there was a kind of an introspective moment in psychology. It was replaced by behaviorism, and this breaks perfectly on that watershed in ways that would be fun to talk about if you want to get into the weeds on it. But let's keep moving. The second chapter looks at the idea that you could assign value to attention. This section really focuses on the history of eye tracking. So we associate eye tracking with a kind of very 21st century sort of, again, Google's out there, you know, or your Tesla might have a camera that's watching where your eyes are to see if you're paying attention to the road or whatnot. But actually, what I've uncovered in this section of the book is the deep and old history of technologies of eye tracking, all of which amounted to a kind of an unholy alliance between experimental psychology and Madison Avenue, the rise of the advertising industry. So this was a genuinely strange moment where, for instance, Look magazine, the primary competitor to Life magazine in the period, endowed a laboratory of like attention studies out in fine Midwestern University to pay the researcher to develop this Brandt eye camera. This is a totally non-digital, right? This is analog eye tracking technology. If I move over there, you won't see me. So let me see. Well, all right. So you see that canister into which the woman is looking up above? That device has a pair of movie cameras on either side, and it flashes a bright light obliquely onto her left and right eye and creates a reflection off of a little protuberance just off of the edge of the cornea. And that reflected ray of light from that concentrated light beam, not a laser, because lasers aren't available at this time, creates a track on the movie film that can be correlated with the image at which she is looking, which is up above her. And you can see that image. It's an image that has a test pattern of a girl's face in different sizes and in different locations. So in the lower image there, what you're seeing is the reconstruction of her gaze as her eyes moved across that suite of images. Now, why would Look magazine be interested in data like that in 1934? Well, they'd be interested in that because that is exactly a way to price out your advertisements. That permits you to say to a potential advertiser, if you want a quarter-page ad in the upper left hand, you will secure 28.4% more eyeballs than you will if you buy a quarter size, an 8 size ad in the lower left-hand corner. This was what was being quantified in this period already. And the research work was being funded directly by industry. And it culminates in this, which is always good for a yuck. This is a full-page ad for Yonkers Men's Shop, which appeared in 1945 in a newspaper, again in the Midwest. And what you're seeing there is that Brandt eye camera, lower left-hand corner, that's the woman, like that's the science. And what has happened is that we've aggregated the gaze of 100 women all over the body of that dude wearing his menswear. And we've quantified the amount of time that their eyes lingered on his different bits, where bits is haberdashery. So it's like they spent, 16% of their time ogling his tie, and another 7.5% on his pocket square. And so you can see this like female gaze being turned into a rationale for investing heavily in your fedora. So there you are, early and often, this connection between attention, in this case in an ocular sense, and money. The next two chapters look really kind of closely at the period from sort of 1942, 43 to sort of 65, so war and its aftermath. I'm interested here in what I call cybernetic attention, so the coordination of humans and machines in attentional terms. These devices are pilot testing apparatuses that were developed in the interwar period to assess the quality of attention achievable by the flyboys you were going to put in the pilot seat of these new and expensive aircraft. And so they're actually extreme state physiology tests. So this gentleman is being asked to conduct an early, again, like analog video game. There's a mechanical sort of like a window on the screen in front of him that drifts left. It's not a screen, machines see screen, walk back screen, no screens. There is literally a little mechanical window in front of him, and he has control over a line or a cursor that is behind that window. And as the window drifts right and drifts left, he can basically screw a little controller that moves the pin with the window. So he has to keep the pin in the window as he's gradually deoxygenated. So he's on a rebreather that's pulling the carbon dioxide out, so he's increasingly breathing deoxygenated air, and he'll lose consciousness eventually. So the question is, how long can he successfully manipulate the controller under those extreme state conditions? Additionally, intricate systems along the same lines. This one actually has pedal apparatus, so when the light goes on here, he has to hit the left pedal. And you can see that what you're doing here is creating the same physical configurations for the hands and feet as control the ailerons in an airplane. So this is like an equivalent test system for an early flight simulator. And so you're at the kind of nexus of the body integrated into a machine in explicitly attentional terms. And the second part of this chapter looks, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of my talk, at the question of vigilance. Here, screens do come in. Many of you will be aware that radar and sonar systems were an innovation of the Second World War. And in the Battle of the English Channel, English aviators were equipped to spot German U-boats using a radar system that was in an airplane that looked like that. And so that little round screen at the center of that radar system is what you have to be looking at to see the fleeting blip that would indicate the presence of a German U-boat in the water below the airplane. What you're looking at here is the first serious challenge. How long can human beings look at screens? And a great deal hung in the balance. And so you had a totally, I want to say clandestine, this was not public research, 42, 43, 44, this was secret research, assessing human capacities to be vigilant to screens for long durations. And that work gave rise to one of the most important papers in experimental psychology in the period, published after the war, Neil Mackworth's Breakdown of Vigilance During Prolonged Visual Search. So this is a paper on human vigilance and the things you can do, give people amphetamines, among other things, but you can also call them after 20 minutes because there is what's called a vigilance decrement that occurs at 20 minutes, which is what this paper identified. So I'm interested in the rise of the field of vigilance studies as a form of attention research in psychology that was inextricable from this new problem of having people be attendant on screens and dials. And in some ways, you know, those of you who know the history of Taylorism, right, time and motion studies in the early 20th century, where labor, like bricklaying, was studied using cameras to try to understand how to optimize the motion of a worker. I think of this section of this book as time and non-motion studies. Because if you think of time and motion studies, that's like the physical labor that we associate with like the late 19th and very early 20th century. By the mid-20th century, there's a very new and interesting kind of labor, which is cybernetic labor. It's the labor of watching the dials on the machine. You're not moving at all, but we have to optimize something new, not optimize physical hauling of dirt, but optimize the question of a certain kind of cognitive durational engagement. And if you think that that is not in the direct genealogical line that leads to you in front of your laptop doing email at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, you are wrong. That is in a genealogical line, but that habitus that has been achieved between you and your machine. So we're seeing the origin of it in these technical studies of time and non-motion in the period. Very quickly, the most important theorist of attention in the 1950s is a guy named Donald Broadbent. Broadbent's filter theory of attention basically holds sway well into the 1970s, and the rise of feature integration theory. Donald Broadbent was another one of these Cold Warrior types. He'd come out of the Second World War and worked with the Royal Air Force on optimizing human capacity in relation to the machines of war. And what he focused on, fascinatingly, was this kind of problem set. Operator within, in this case, an aircraft carrier, who is giving instructions to somebody on a deck while receiving instructions from somebody on a bridge. So these obligatory passage points for multi-channel information. Another classic problem are gunnery soldiers who are receiving targeting information from somebody who is range finding, and they're giving instructions to the guys who are actually positioning the cannons. So you've got information in, information in, information out, information out. And fascinatingly, the theory of attention that Donald Broadbent arrives at, the filter theory, is quite literally a literalization of the problem of like information coming into both ears on a headset, which happened to be the problem that he studied during the 1940s. For Donald Broadbent, you want to know what attention is? Attention is that little dangly flap in the Y of that stent. So what is meant by that? Right, he says, that reads, if you can't read it, the simple model for attention. Broadbent believed, and we still hold in contemporary neuroscience a version of this theory, that what attention is a information overload regulating problem. More information comes into our senses than our central processing unit can manage. And so what attention is whatever determines what gets through to higher cognitive processing. Now there's very interesting experimental evidence that this is not the whole story, much of which comes out this period, and if you want to talk about that, we can turn to it. But at this level, in 1958, he has a model that says basically like, imagine that you were trying to dump balls into those two upper legs of the Y. And you can sort of imagine how, under certain circumstances, if you dumped enough balls in both sides at the same time, the whole thing would just jam. And that is what happens if I'm like reading to you in French in this ear and German in this ear, and you're trying to like follow both at the same time, information overload, you're done. He says, in fact, what you have to do is like decide what aspect of incoming sensory channel you're going to permit to get the higher cognition. He also thought this explained how sort of like there was a distinction between voluntary and involuntary attention. What if a really big ball was coming in the right-hand side, super hard and super fast, while little tiny balls were kind of trickling in on the left side? So you could immediately imagine that that flap would be whacked over and the fast-moving hard ball would come down the channel, even if there was more little light fluffy balls coming in on the other side. So he played out this like metaphor, how attention operated as a filtration problem. Okay, so I'm gonna basically, how am I doing on time? Maybe another 5 minutes, you think? And then get to, okay. So 5 minutes means that unless you ask for it in Q&A, you won't have to do the business about the little contemporary philosophy of mind stuff, but anybody who asks, boom, I'll pull those slides up. But instead I'll basically I'll finish here. And this is a good place to end because it lets me set up the upshot. Like if you're out there being like, okay, but so what? I'm gonna try to do an answer to the so what question in the next 3.5 minutes. Because in chapter 6, I pivot to a kind of counter project of the science of attention that I believe surfaces a sublated story of what attention is and can be, a story sublated across chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? The kinds of attention that I have been discussing up to this point are essentially instrumentalized. They are triggering and tracking forms of attention. They're accounts of attention that you get if you put a person in a chair in a laboratory and start sort of whizzing a stimulus past them. And I suspect to get your various degrees, you spend a certain amount of time in laboratories in which something like that was happening. And so if you put people in chairs and whiz stimuli past them and then ask them about their attention, you get whizzy stimulus accounts of what attention is, unsurprisingly. So instrumentalized theories of attention that are essentially about triggering and tracking. I want to suggest that there's a very different way of thinking about attention. One that has been cued for you in your reading for today, interestingly, I didn't assign it, but the Simone Weil, I would say, is an exquisite invocation of what I would want to call an apophatics of attention, a kind of negative theology of attention, which complements, but is ultimately, fundamentally, the other of the kind of instrumentalized attention that I've just been tracking across the history of experimental psychology for 60 years. And to give you a flavor of what it looks like when you start to try to study that other thing and the weirdness that is to happen, let's go to the 1960s where things do get weird. And let's talk about Arthur Dykman for a moment. Arthur Dykman was another military scientist. He was a medical doctor from Harvard who spent 6 years in the Air Force, but he got interested in, if you like, what happened if you sat somebody down in a laboratory chair and then gave them basically no stimulus at all? Just see what happens. And the result completely blew his mind. It's a little bit like sensory deprivation work that was going on in the same period, the work of Lilly and some of the MK Ultra kinds of folks, where it's like, what happens to the mind when you actually cut it off from its ordinary kind of network of instrumentalized problems? So in a series of what were called blue vase experiments, Dykman put people in a room and put a vase in front of them and said, just look at the vase, as long as you like, just sit there. And he was quite surprised that people began to have these kind of trippy out-of-body experiences and dance with the vase, would begin to dance and come for them, and they were enveloped in the vase. And his experimental reports were like, what? Because, and in fact, there's no drugs. This is not like, by the way, let's drop acid and do these experiments. Not at all. It's just like sit in a chair and look at the vase. And people are like, kapow. And so Dykman begins to sort of get interested in something like the kind of receptivity of an attentional mode. Quite touchingly, he ends up getting hired. It was a different era by the National Parks Department to write a set of guides to how to kind of open yourself to being present as you visit the national parks. So it's like the opposite of a traditional guidebook that would like tell you to go here and go there and go the other place. This is sort of just like, open yourself, man, and be there, and it will be incredible. And so that's one key of this, what I want to call the kind of negative attention, like apophatics of attention, pure immanence of attentionality. And then the other, which has an even firmer kind of political balance, is the work of Charles Hubble. Hubble was formed in the tradition of the Society of Friends, who had some Quaker back in him. Also had spent time in the Air Force, interestingly. So all these guys are sort of on trajectories out and away from the cybernetic programmatics. He ends up as a professor of psychology in Santa Barbara, and starting in 1965-66, he begins leading silent vigils for peace. And in a chapter of the book, I look closely at the emergence of the silent vigil as a form of political protest in the 1960s. And I contrast the silent vigil to the sit-in and to the occupation and to other forms of voiced manifestation. There are no placards, there are no signs, there are no chants, there is no singing. And he was quite explicit about this, that what he was opting for was no messaging at all, just presence. And these took off in a totally amazing way. There were hundreds and hundreds of them across the United States by 1966. And though you might say, the silent vigil, that has to have been a form of protest since forever, right? No, says the historian with that draw and distort sense. They actually happened in 1966. I'll be darned. And this is a little plyometrics for those of you who like data. This is an engram of the English language corpus for silent vigil. And this is a trick I teach grad students if you want to do this kind of research. This is actually the curve that you get if you do the engram search for silent vigil in scare quotes, which is way cool because it's a way of seeing the neologism. This is literally 1966. Everyone's like silent vigil because it's not a thing that anybody has ever heard before. If you take the scare quotes away, you see the same kind of okay, blips in 66, but then it enters a language in a very real way in the subsequent years. So I'm interested in the way that kind of speechlessness, but presence and attention functions as a form of political messaging. So I think what I'll do is leave it there, just teeing up one more time, that there is a history of attention that traces this triggering and tracking line, but there is also a kind of account of attention that is rooted in a kind of suspension and waiting. Indeed, in French, attendre is wait, which is sort of an interesting fact, so that not has something attentional in it. And I think that the work we need to do now, and this swings back to the activism, is remind people of this forgotten and largely sublated form of attentionality that has this imminence to it, because we have been also entirely interpolated to the triggering and tracking form of attention, that even our efforts to defend our attention against commodification end up using a language that is already bought and paid for by those instrumentalizing techniques. If you've got an app in there that's doing your screen time, it's basically quantifying your attention and then giving you back quantas of attention that you can spend somewhere else. But what the apophatic theory of attention reminds us is that attention actually has significant registers that are outside of that whole economy. And that's the form of attention we need if we have any hope of protecting something. I used to say human, but I've learned to say non-inhuman, which I think is actually kind of a little better armed to protect itself against some of the meaningful critiques of humanism that we've all learned over the last few decades, okay? So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, so excellent. Emily, I'm just gonna check this. Is the camera only on the podium? We can move it. Maybe when the respondents come up, you can each give your response here, and then we can all take our seats there, and we can move the camera. Is that good? Now, you said that you do the philosophical, theoretical thing if someone asks you, and as a philosopher, I'm very tempted to hold off on the responses, but no, maybe we'll go whenever we can. Thank you.
Well, I'm also a philosopher, Matt. I can do it too. I just have some thoughts. This is kind of like a jazz riff on that talk. So I do Buddhist philosophy and medical ethics, and so I have some thoughts about that. I'll start with my favorite philosopher joke because my first question has to do with that, which is people in this room have probably heard me say this before. Do you guys know the philosopher meme? You're smiling. Do you know the philosopher meme? No? Does anyone know the philosopher meme? It's what do philosophers, toddlers, and the Backstreet Boys have in common? Does anyone know? I heard it.
Tell me why.
Tell me why. They all have to tell me why. Okay. So because I'm an ethicist, the thought that was kind of running through my head with this is why be attentive? What is actually the purpose? What does it get us other than like money, right, or attention to goods that we want to sell? And as a Buddhist philosopher, this is something that I think about a lot, and people often ask me about my own work, which is that there is this emphasis on cultivating a certain level of attention, right? Attention is central to Buddhist meditation practice. And what is sometimes lost is that there is a purpose to that, which is developing compassion, right, and liberating all sentient beings. And so in Buddhism, part of the idea is that when you pay attention to your experience, you realize that the kind of like ego self that you hold on to, right, doesn't exist. So the things that you think are really important are actually impermanent. That those things that you think are standalone things are actually interdependent, and that allows you to develop compassion, right? Because you see how you're interconnected with everything. So that was kind of one of the first thoughts I had, thinking about attention. The other is the Wilhelm Wundt reference was fascinating because I work on Kyoto School of Philosophy, so Nishida Kitaro has this famous book called Inquiry into the Good. It was his first text, and he's really responding to people like Wundt, who I've only ever seen referenced by Nishida, which is fascinating, people like James, and what he's trying to develop is a theory of pure experience. So this is my second kind of question, which you kind of got to.
What's the author's name again? I don't know this.
Nishida Kitaro. He was so famous in Japan that when his books came out, people would like sleep on the streets outside the bookstore in order to get his books. So he's famous for this theory of pure experience, and part of what he's trying to define is this idea that it sounds like the last slide you put up of the psychologist who is trying to, what was it? It was like forced contemplative meditation or something. What was the phrase? Induced. Yeah, like very Western way. You know, like how can we make this happen to people? But the idea is that, right, pure experience is what happens in a meditative state, which is that you're not attending to objects. You're just having experience without a subject-object distinction. And what's interesting for Nishida is he identifies that state of pure experience with the good. So this is in his work called Inquiry into the Good, right? And so part of what I'm thinking about after this talk is how does, right, like attention relate to the good, being good people, compassion. And then just the last thing that I'll mention is that, so I work at the intersection of, again, ethics, medicine, neuroscience, and one of the things that's always bothered me is in disorders of consciousness, the way that consciousness is medically like diagnosed is wakeful awareness. And so awareness, clinicians figure out if you're aware by seeing if you track objects, right? Like, so do your eyes follow. So wakefulness is just you open your eyes. Awareness is like you track objects in space. And one of the things that's always bothered me about this clinical assessment of consciousness is that we're just tracking awareness of objects, right? And so there's this privileging of an instrumental form of consciousness that is focusing on objects without necessarily thinking about her experience. The very last thing I'll say is that I would love to know what you think. So I teach a neuroethics class, and we talk a lot about like neuroscience, consciousness, these kinds of things. We talk about Benjamin Libet's famous free will experiment, and one of the things that's always been interesting to me with that is, right, so he's basically saying that there's no free will because he asked people to like tell him when they felt the urge to move their finger, and then move their finger, and he was measuring EEG while that was happening, and he basically found that the brain registers a signal that it's prepared, like there's a signal before someone moves their finger, before they're aware that they're gonna move their finger. And so there's this idea that because the brain is doing stuff before we're aware of the desire to do something, there can't be free will because it's all. And so how does attention get distinguished from awareness in that kind of psychological context? Okay, lots of riffs and thoughts, and I'll let the theologian come up next.
Thank you, Grant. That was amazingly stimulating. I hope you noticed that by the attention that I gifted to you. When I was walking, so I'm Leo Guardado, I'm in the theology department. I teach, among other things, classes on mysticism or Christian mystical texts for undergraduates. One of my students is here, thank you. And at the doctoral level, liberation theology, Latin American liberation theology, so particular attention to the category of the insignificant, the poor, the margins, and what we may say from a theological perspective about all of that. Let me just start with locating myself here. As I was walking here, I got off the subway, the one, as there were two people at the corner on 60th and Broadway who wanted my attention, and they were aggressively seeking, excuse me, can I? And I skirted them, and I kind of went, you may have encountered them. And since I have been reading about attention, it's like, oh, they really want my attention. I don't know why, but I can suspect that it's probably to sell me something, to sign something, to defend something, to make me aware of something. But when I realized I was really curious after I skirted their attempts to get my attention aggressively, I was very curious what they wanted. And so I was left with that curiosity. Maybe I should have made time, or given my attention, gifted my attention to them. I only start with that because thinking about attention, listening to this presentation, this lecture, just makes me aware of those micro interventions of sorts, or micro moments of daily life, what I do with my time, my attention, and how I gift it, or how it's extracted, or attempts to extract it from me. So thinking about the registers of aggression with attention. And so I don't have a formal response other than thinking with Graham's lecture here. One of the kind of lines of thought or questions, registers that kind of oscillated throughout for me was, how does all of this, in terms of the genesis of attention studies, especially war studies and Cold War studies, and I love the way you ended toward the end, kind of the way my phrase would be like nonviolence, or gesturing toward that. But how does that same study of attention for war studies help us think about peace studies? My doctor is also in peace studies and theology, so I'm kind of thinking along those lines. But how do we turn this all upside down, which I think you're attempting to do toward the end of the book, and really think in relation to peace studies and all the philosophies, anthropologies, and education layers, and theologies and philosophies that accompany peace studies now, and that's simply war studies. How do we, in a way, put attention at the very center of peace studies? In the same way that it was at the heart of war studies. And peace studies develops as discipline out of war studies, or in relation to war studies, really. But people, not only social scientists and economists, but the humanities kind of gathering together and saying, we may have something to say about how to research peace, and not simply war. So that's one of the things, silver linings throughout for me, is what does this look like from the perspective of the worst survival? Where we fill in the category of the poor? I work primarily with churches supervised sanctuary, and you raised the question of sanctuary. I was hearing echoes of maybe Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, in her last chapter, on the right to sanctuary, the right to have a place that is non-extractive from the data mining that happens of our human nature, our anthropology, what we call theological anthropology, how we are made in relation to, let's divine, whatever we call that, but that is being extracted, our very human anthropologies are being extracted and given back to us in particular registers that are more predisposed to whatever it is that they want to sell, or I think it's more than selling at this point, that they want to create us onto. I mean, this is the God role now. We are being created onto certain, more than markets, and certain ways of being that you said, more than human, that are dehumanizing. I think it's even more than that. I mean, I'm not sure what it is, but we may not have a category for it yet. What else do I want to say here? Maybe in chapter 5, just again reflecting out loud here, still with the Cold War chapter, you have that image of the why, and I just kept thinking from a theological perspective, what would I call that capacity to adjudicate, to make those decisions or to filtrate? I would use the word discernment for my discipline, like how we discern, how we intuitively discern some things. We don't think about it. It's a non-dual register of mind. In the mystics class, when we get to Dogen, in the kind of the Buddhist tradition, we have one session on Dogen and kind of Zen Buddhism and one on Rumi. And we've talked a lot about thinking, not thinking, and then non-thinking. And what does this non-thinking invite us into? And I think of that, and when I think of discernment, how do we, sometimes we just discern. In New York City, and I've only been here 5 or 5.5 years or so, I intuitively have the capacity, as you all do if you've survived here, to navigate the sidewalks and just weave yourself through people without crashing. I mean, how often do you actually crash into people? Once in a while. But you just intuitively know and can read the bodies of other people, so how they inhabit time and space, and you do what you need to do to be around them, literally. That kind of intuitive discernment that happens in, I'm not even sure that it's in time. It does because we're embodied in time, but it just happens instantaneously. It was micro, nano fractions of a second. Seems to me like the words that I would use to talk about what's happening in that why, what constitutes attention. So attention as this profound capacity to discern. Discern what? We can talk about the good, discern life. Discernment, of course, from a theological perspective, is at the heart of, and from the Christian kind of mystical traditions, is at the heart of ultimately this intuitive discernment of what the Desert fathers and mothers were practicing. Evagrius, for example, his whole theology, this desert monk in the deserts of Egypt, is teaching the young monks how to get to this place of intuitive discernment or intuitive knowledge of the divine. It's not thought knowledge, it's not knowledge that comes through the process of intellectual thinking. It's just knowledge that you encounter. And maybe that is talking about another point here, this may be getting long, but this whole notion of encounter and relationality that is at the root of attention, and the ecstasy of it. So in your chapter 6, for whatever reason, you talked about presence a lot. And one of the things that I say to my students in the mystics class is that this is all about being present to the presence. So it assumes for Christian tradition, some kind of presence to be present to, or in the non-Christian tradition, or maybe Zen tradition, just present to the to impermanence. I'm not sure, I won't go there, but Laura can throw that in. But that ecstasy, you can only actually begin to inhabit without inhabiting that presence by going out of yourself, that ecstasis. But that ecstasy, by its very nature of there being an other, whether that's God or the human other, I think has that eros, that desire that leads you out. So this is where I think another question, thought, comment that comes to the fore for me is that what is the role of love in all of this? What is the role of, yes, desire, in a deeper sense, that desire that draws you, that moves the intellect. Thinking here with the classic mystic Catherine of Siena, who really talks about the three faculties of the soul: desire or will, the intellect, and memory. And how they all have to be together and working together for the journey, the ascent, or the the intuitive knowledge of God to actually take place, and that, you know, what controls your desires is what you're going to think about. So I say this in class over and over. That which you want is what you're going to think about. That which you think about is what you're going to remember. So this is how it all works. Your desires ultimately lead to memory. What memory is the residue of all that you want and that you thought of because of that. So desire and love, where does this fit into the question of attention? Because at least from a theological perspective, of course, that desire of the mystics is that desire for that other who undoes you. So this is the apophatic term there, that undoes you completely and radically, so that there is some sense of no self, or the passing over of the mind, as Bonaventure would say, so that you can be the other, so that you can inhabit, in one sense, without inhabiting the other, or be in that profound relationship that is beyond any capacity for you to control. Maybe with that, then the last question that I want to just put on the floor is memory and attention. As I already mentioned, and as we think of like trauma and trauma studies, how does attention, I'm not sure what you want, rehumanizes us, resists the dehumanization, puts us back together in a way that never will be what we were, but that nonetheless allows for that self in writ large to somehow constitute itself vis-a-vis everything else that wants to constitute it. I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. This was really super tonight. And I'm David Mark Houghton, a Jesuit priest and clinical psychologist. And these days I'm teaching a course in psychology of well-being. And I've just thought about a couple of things from your talk. One, this question of why be attentive at all to begin with, and what should we be attentive to? And I thought about early in my training, this moment with a spiritual director when he was listening to me go on about something I was quite torn up about. I can't even remember what it was, and convinced it was a complete distraction from what I wanted to work on, I was interested in. And he remarked that, well, there really is no such thing as a distraction. And that idea of what are we attending to is what ultimately will allow us to arrive at a place of freedom to say yes. And that really is a very kind of urgent spiritual task, I suppose, and opening to things. So that was just one thought that crossed my mind as you were speaking. The other idea being that attending for a narrative, a story that is being told and will evolve. So then the second thought that occurred to me is the idea of attention as a sort of an individual project. That tends to be the sort of the frame of reference. And what happens when it's really not that, but maybe a shared entity? What happens when it's attention for companionship and attention in the context of companionship? I think that's a challenge for kind of the American individualist orientation. We automatically think either we're responsible for our attention or, you know, at an individual level. So those are just 2 points.
So thank you so much.
Ready to turn on your microphone and respond to whatever comments came up, and then briefly, I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, so after you do, I will kind of open it up and I'll bring the microphone around.
Is this on then? People are in internet land are hearing from this? Okay. Yeah, so much that's so rich in there. I mean, I am maybe to begin just with David's last point about attention and the individual versus collective experience. I think one of the things that's been at the heart of the work of the Strother School, just to put in a plug again for the Strother School of Radical Attention in Brooklyn, we run these workshops, and so often we'll have 50 people in a room in BK, and people will begin to talk in terms of like their mindfulness or their meditation practice. And we always are quick to be very positive about that. We sort of go like, we're good with that. But we also are kind of aware of certain kinds of critiques of kind of big mindfulness as sort of capitalist religion, the kind of suborning of like these rich contemplative traditions, and their repurposing as a kind of instrumentalized band-aid for the conditions of neoliberal overwork. So it's like, we're going to take away your healthcare, but we will give you a mindfulness app. And we're really keen for you to be like more present to yourself as your teeth decay, because we don't have a dental plan. So, and we don't get into this in like, this level of in the weeds, but we do say mindfulness is great. Here at the Strother School, we're very focused on joint attention. And indeed, joint attention is a distinct category within psychology and neuroscience. It turns out that humans, from very early on, are actually distinguishable, and this starts to get into the weeds. Those of you who are onlooking who may be primatologists, I'm not trying to have an argument with you. But it turns out you can distinguish human infants from primate infants along the axis of their responsiveness to joint attentional situations pretty early. We are way, way keyed to these kinds of forms of indexicality, right? If you've ever tried to like point to something for your dog, and like the dog, you're like, behind you, geez. The dog is not like, wait, behind me. They don't do that. They don't read us that way. Whereas humans are super cued to those kinds of collective attentional moments. And so we're especially focused on breaking the kind of solipsism of our current relation to attentional triggering by creating conditions in which joint attention becomes a sort of scene of world making. The sharing of attention produces a world, and I mean, you touched me quick with your indication of the language of pure experience. So I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the text you invoked, but I've already called it up right here. I'm using these devices for what they're good for, to buy on Amazon important texts that remain in print within the tradition. Because I actually taught a grad seminar with my beloved colleague Jeff Dahlman on the category of experience. So we were especially interested in how that term is kind of played out in the Western epistemic problematic. Historians of science will be quick to remind you that in French, there isn't a distinction between the word experiment and experience. And so a basic and deep proposition that Gadamer nails is that if you want to understand what happens in the Western scientific tradition, you could do no better than to understand the experimental method as a technique for turning pure experience into it puts it in harness for epistemics. It's a way of taking radical experientiality, like experience, and rendering it collective so that it can draw water and cut wood in the world of techne, craft, and the manipulation of the material world. So that's really cool, and what it would be to go back and get an experiential attunement that is severed from that distinctive epistemic program and the instrumentalizing program that comes with it, because I would say, it's not like we're making this stuff up. I mean, Husserl was kind of already there, in a sense, noticing that this was the problem with the crisis of the European sciences. And then there's a bunch of people, including the folks we're talking about, that come out of that tradition, and even that slightly messed around proto-Jesuit Heidegger himself was interested in this stuff, where he went kind of so wrong. So there's a lot to say about this. And I'm struck too by the language of attention to the poor and a question of ethics of attention. And I want to get time for some questions, so I'll finish here. I was just at a conference in Galway on the ethics of attention. Sylvia Panizza, who's a very brilliant Italian scholar, just finished a book called The Ethics of Attention, which I would recommend to everyone. And there's a bunch of people who work on Iris Murdoch who do this, because this is like Iris Murdoch on one side and on the other. She sort of digs in with Simone Weil's Vedic gestures in a mystical key and sort of, again, breaks it down for you in a kind of Oxford philosophy of mind way and uses the account. And nutshelling that, her claim, and by her there, I'm just going to let Bay and Murdoch meld for a moment because it's really one program, articulated, I would say, differently, is that it is suffering that obligates any real ethic to ground itself in attention. So I don't know what relationship any of this has to the Buddhist tradition. I won't try, but I will say that what Bay says is ultimately because to operate in pain, which is only one's own, can't be fixed. You can't do anything for that. There is affliction, which is her harrowing word, right? It's, in that beautiful letter that she writes to her friend who still had a ball from the First World War in his back, and he just suffered all the time. And she's like, you are like the centering point for an ethic, because you're just suffering, it's not fixable. And so what can you do with that? There's no fixing. And so with affliction, all that can be done is the being with that is attention. And so this is pretty intense stuff, and Bay is an ambivalent guide in the sphere of practical ethics, given we're in endgames, and I think reasonable people could disagree about what she can teach us, but because affliction, therefore only in ethics of attention, because affliction is the substrate, and all that can be done is you can be accompanied in affliction, attention. And for that reason, she believes, in the passage that you all read, that it's good to try to do hard math problems, because hard math problems are like getting you going to learn attention, and ultimately all attention is propedeutic to prayer, and has as its sort of horizon love, and the reason you would do it is so that you can walk with those who are in the margins. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, I hate to do this because you have so captivated our attention tonight, but I think we are at time. Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking over. Do we have a minute or two for Q&A, you think? Can we extend it out?
Yeah, we can stick around.
If anyone wants to stick around, let's do a few minutes of question and answer. Anyone who needs to leave can feel free to leave. So, questions?
Thank you very much for all of this. It's so rich. I have a specific question about what was talked about in the New Yorker article about the practice that your group does. There was a letter a couple of weeks later where someone compared that to a practice called Lectio Divina.
Yeah, the Lectio Divina.
Yeah, and I'm wondering about, when you mentioned silent vigil coming up, that term in quotes comes up, that is significant because prior to that, vigil meant silence, that there were practices of collective attention or individual attention that were kind of built into, and I'm thinking centuries ago, that were built into people's kind of practices of being in the world. And so I guess I'm wondering a little bit about the absence of those practices in our contemporary world, and how we have replaced them with not only these small objects, but kind of revering this kind of attention, what this pulls out of us, that we are no longer actually sort of sitting in a darkened chapel, sitting vigil with the Holy Host anymore.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I mean, it's funny for me to be here in a kind of formally Jesuit ecology, because I'm an essentially secular thinker. Everything that I presented today, I think, passes the smell test of secularity. And indeed, everything we do at the Struthers School is also kind of vigilantly unaligned with respect to spiritual traditions. We want to be able to work with the DoD, we want to be in schools and stuff like that. So we do not show up and talk about Trappist waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning for vigils, especially, except in a kind of, here's an interesting example way. That said, I'm happy to say, just personally, because I'm here, I would say it even if I weren't among friends, but I am. So I'm a practicing Catholic, and a great deal of, there is a strong relationship between my interest in this topic and my own interest in contemplative and meditative practices. So David would know that, I went under direction with a fantastic older Jesuit and did the spiritual exercises under the 19th meditation across a very important year in my life. And so I do the consciousness examine daily, and it's an important part of my life. However, I have a 15-year-old kid with 20,000 followers on TikTok who's really helped me. I am 100% moving forward into the new world with this stuff, and I'm always at pains to keep my distance from everybody who wants to whinge about how nobody wants to read Plato these days. Whenever I end up on a panel and they've got 2 of those people who are from St. John's, or they're feeling embittered about, and I love it. I'm in favor of learning Greek, don't get me wrong. It's cool to learn Greek, it's really cool. But I'm not gonna go and kind of just be back in the old days when people didn't have knees, and they did all their bending in the waist, and it was better, No, actually, there are fantastic TikTok trends that involve looking at something and imagining licking it. And I think that's the coolest attentional practice ever. When Leo brought me that, I was like, yo, this is bomb. We gotta do this. We have to do attentional practices that involve looking at things and then taking 7 minutes just thinking about licking it. That's Ignatius would have loved it. Can I say that? Is that okay? Are there any Ignatius scholars in here? I think Ignatius would have totally understood that was a very powerful method for training imaginative work. And that's the kind of interior exercise of will and imagination and memory, the intellect, the sort of basic operation of the faculties. So I say that because on the one hand, yes, I think these are rich repositories of practice, and everybody who's got a practice, bring it to the table, because it is literally crisis time. It's all hands on deck for the battle royale. I'm not afraid to say that. So if you've got a practice, bring it. And I don't care if it's licking things in your imagination, or if you like to go out to Gethsemane and wake up at 2:15 in the morning every day for 5 or 6 days in order to really feel it. Good. What we confront at this moment with respect to a $4 to $6 trillion per annum industry that is hiring all of the smartest school leaders and has all of the deepest pocketed VCs and manages most of the computational power of the Western Hemisphere that is not operated by the Pentagon, that's a meaningful suite of adversaries. And they want to turn the stuff out of which you make yourself and your relation to others and your relation to the earth into bank, and they are not in favor of your human humanity. They're the opposition. So everything you can do, everybody you got, bring them on, because
So that's a good segue into the question that I have. You began by introducing yourself as a historian, and you just made reference to your son and so on. How do you reconcile the kind of historical dimension of what we're seeing? And I'll preface this by saying I'm down with the idea of the crisis as well. But where do you stand that allows you to be able to proclaim it as a crisis rather than another moment in the evolution of human mentality and relatedness and so on? I mean, it's clear, even though you don't want to do the St. John's thing, that there's something about the present moment that you bemoan, that you see as somehow dehumanizing. I mean, you wouldn't use a metaphor of fractal. Is it that there is something essentially human that is being debased and denied and degraded at this point? Or is it ultimately an issue of the good? That is it possible that what we're seeing now has so divided people and separated itself off from joint attention, from relationality, that we're seeing a point of no return? So I guess I want to get a sense of what your own foundation is.
Yeah.
That led you to establish a foundation precisely devoted to serving as a counterweight to this crisis.
Thank you. It feels like a probing question. So, as a historian, it seems to me that it's possible both for this to be a cataclysmic crisis and for it to be just another moment. That's sort of like part of what's so weird and cool about history is that, like, sometimes people will say, isn't this just another moral panic? Like when there was TV, there was a moral panic, or when there were telephones, or when there were railroads. And I'm sort of like, yeah, actually, but like a lot of those people, they were right that worlds were ending and that what was coming was like newly cataclysmic and difficult. So that doesn't mean I have a declensionist theory of human time or something like that, nor would I argue, in polite company at any rate, that sort of Satan is on the side of objectification. And so, like, objects and their kind of totemic etherealization as money are gradually taking their wins in the battle royale against the spirit. I would never really go there. As I say, so I think the answer is that there have been many crises. I often joke, it's not even a joke, all learning in the Western tradition is Latinate until roughly 1770 or so, and that means there were a lot of dissertations in Latin in libraries, like in Utrecht, that nobody has read because they were done in 1735 and somebody got their PhD, they worked really hard, and then basically people started working the vernacular and there are only 11 people that could bother to read the kind of things. And similarly, we're at such a watershed, we're ending immersive long-form literacy. It's over. Y'all still, some of you presumably read books, but this is done. Books are not a thing. So a few people read books, just like a few people still read Latin, but it's not going to be a culture. So that's really, I take that in the chin, because I was formed to a bookish world, and so it's intense till I see that stop. Do I think humanity stops from books? No, there's lots of interesting stuff that happens. And the tradition that is bookish is not going to disappear. That's why it's so exciting and interesting to be operating right now as a scholar. We have this immense responsibility. Those of us who sort of nod if, I allude to Husserl, you have your work cut out for you. Because no one's reading The Crisis of the European Science System now, and nobody's reading it in a decade. And so we have to figure out what to do with what's in that book that you can give it to people, because there's interesting stuff in that book, like there's interesting stuff in all of our bunch of books that we have to figure out how to give to people who aren't going to read them, meaning everyone. And so this is an interesting opportunity for those of us who are teachers and relate to this textual tradition. Similarly, we know something about attentional forms, which are a little like no longer so obviously available. But so did people in the 19th century. You ever pick up the Library of America double-volume edition of Lincoln's speeches? Like, it's really amazing, because you're like, wait, people, like farmers in Illinois, listen to this for like 3.5 hours on Saturday afternoon? We couldn't do that, and we think of ourselves as presumably the kind of people who like long lectures about American politics. I mean, forget it, it was just a totally different culture of the sort of pulpit and acoustic literacy listening was totally different. So stuff's been changing the whole way. We especially need to get some of the stuff we know about these attentional traditions and bring them forth while listening to the kids with the TikTok and the licking exercises. Because we need to figure out what we're going to do so as not to have everybody taught in their actual agential personhood, pulled from wellness into immiseration, right? Like, what's discernment for? Discernment in the Jesuit tradition is for figuring out what steps lead you to consolation and which steps lead you to desolation. And so, like, let's start talking to you because you're taking steps that lead you to desolation because there's people who want to, like, turn you into money. And that's bad for people, is it not? So anyway, you've heard me enough on this. Hey! Somebody get us out of there.
With that water spill.
That's hard.
No, I'm being given the look from the back that tells me it's my job is to wrap things up. So with that, Graham, thank you so much. Thank you to our respondents. This has just been an absolutely excellent talk. I'm thrilled with how it turned out, so thank you. And again, for anyone getting CEs at home, please make sure you fill out the survey. Thank you all.